Welcome everyone to Quickie Sunday. What we are going through quickly for today is our recap of how the situation in the raid has been so far in Vault of the Incarnates in Season 1 of Dragonflight. We haven't checked, we haven't stopped and had our raid update in quite a while, in almost 2 weeks actually, since the last time we checked on how the situation was. So let's move on quickly and check how things have been in the raid. This was roughly the start of the season, or we should say the more important part of the season, because this was within the first month or so of progression of Vault of the Incarnates when it came to DPS Performance. And this was, for example, just the last time we checked at how the performance was for the DPS. And you can already see a significant difference. For example, the Death Knights doing significantly worse. For example, the complete fall down to the bottom of Assassination Rogue, Elemental and Enhancement Shaman both fell by a whole lot of ranks. There was the hopium of Retribution Paladin suddenly doing much better, and then of course something we have mentioned multiple times, the buffs going to Warriors, going to Shadow Priest and going to Devastation Evoker, which we have talked about for quite a few weeks now, and we can see them in the last time we checked doing significantly better compared to the start of this tier. As for the situation at the moment, perhaps the most notable thing is that the Hopium Dream for Retribution Paladin crashed and burned. Suddenly, Red Paladin has not been doing nearly as well as a couple of weeks ago. Then again, most Red Paladin players are still hoping a lot for the changes coming in patch 10.0.7, which will significantly change and at the moment it seems like significantly empower the spec for the upcoming season. Other significant changes were the Hunter buffs. There are also a few more Hunter buffs coming in 10.0.7, but at the moment there has been a resurgence of pretty much all three Hunter specs at the same time. As you know, 10.0.7 is going to adjust Neltharax, the epic bow for hunters dropping from Razageth, and Blizzard has decided to fix the special effect of Neltharax, and in return give a compensation buff to hunters, compensation buff which will end up still being a flat buff to all three hunter specs, in particular still to Beast Mastery Hunter. So definitely looking good for hunters, given that they haven't even received that buff yet. This is just with the plus 5% more damage done to all three hunter specs, and they are now doing significantly better again. Also, a little bit of a peek back to the single target, to the boss damage done by specs, to see once again Beast Mastery Hunter at the top. This is going to be particularly interesting given that Beast Mastery Hunter is also going to get buffed in single target damage in 10.0.7, as they are already the better performing single target spec. Another thing worth checking is that once again, the performance of a spec in any given encounter doesn't really have much to do with its popularity, for example. Best ways to show this are, for example, Balanced Druid, still being comfortably in the top 3 of most popular specs, despite not really ever being towards the top of performance. There is also then Frost Mage, also very popular, because Mage itself is popular, even though this tier Mage has not been particularly strong. Ever since Demonology has, dropped off by quite a bit in performance, its popularity has still remained quite high, and once again the reverse is true as well. If some niche specs are doing well, their popularity is not increasing by too much. For example, Feral Druid. Despite Feral Druid doing quite well this tier, their popularity is still quite low. Something that might become relevant in a little bit is the popularity of healers, which we haven't looked at particularly in the past few weeks, because it was mostly still the same. Mostly we still saw Preservation Evoker and Restoration Druid topping the charts of popularity, with a significant gap, almost basically a 50% gap, from Holy Priest and then Holy Paladin in the middle. Another gap down in the bottom 3, Resto Shaman, Mistweaver Monk, and Discipline Priest. What is interesting is that in 10.0.7, Holy Paladin is going to receive a significant rework to the general tree of Paladin, which will also be a buff to Holy Paladin as well. Also, Restoration Shaman is going to receive quite the rework to its talent trees, both the general one and also the spec specific one. So it's going to be interesting to see if both Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin will grow more and more in popularity after 10.0.7 to get close, in anticipation of 10.1. Meanwhile, while you can excuse Discipline, because if Holy Priest is popular, it's very likely that Discipline will not be. Meanwhile, for Mistweaver, it looks like it's once again a lost cause, despite the several amount of buffs and quality of life improvements that Blizzard tried to give Mistweaver in the past weeks, even the past months. It does not look like it had any effect on the popularity of Mistweaver Monk, at the very least in the raid. Perhaps it might also have to be with them not being very good, or not being very good at staying alive, because this is the death chance of your spec when you go into a mythic raid boss. This is both if you are wiping or if you're actually killing the boss. These are the percentage chances of your spec dying. We see, surprisingly, Holy Priest being the least likely to die, together with Restoration and Preservation Evoker towards the bottom, and then at the top you have a gap for Discipline and Mistweaver Monk, despite both of them also being the least played specs. Of course, on with the urban legends, on with the memes. Now we have in the top 3 of most dying specs, Marksmanship Hunters, the so-called Huntards by default, as well as Retribution Paladin, the Retadins. Also in the middle, to complete the trifecta of most likely to die specs, you have the new spec, the Flavor of the Month, rerolling characters going Devastation Evoker, despite also Evoker being quite agile, quite quick to move around and to dodge mechanics, etc. in the raid, they still die quite a bit, much more compared to the usual suspects of tankiness. Rogues generally, thanks to Cheat Death as well, are quite tanky. You have Warlocks, of course, notoriously very tanky, as well as Havoc Demon Hunter, with their very high mobility plus very high leech and self-sustain. It's quite hard to kill them. Towards the top of the most likely to die, you also have more squishy specs or more immobile specs, like Shadow Priest, for example, being one of the more liable to be dying in a raid encounter. Lastly, you have the tanks, although to be fair, tanks are not nearly as important as the rest of the group, because tanks of course are more liable to die due to boss mechanics. Unsurprisingly, the least likely to die is Blood Death Knight, because first of all of its self-sustain, so even if the healers are dropping the ball here and there, Blood DK doesn't really care, and number 2, because they have a cheat death. Unlike Protection Warrior, unlike Guardian Druid, and unlike Protection Paladin, at the very least a proper cheat death, they do have one, so they are much less likely to die when they are tanking a raid boss. Now, to finish the recap at how the situation in the raid has been going, if you can squeeze your eyes quite a bit, here is the current situation in the raid, how it has been growing since January the 9th, basically since the first round of buffs and nerfs and tuning that Blizzard started to dish out all the way up to current day. So the biggest change, of course, is the growth of Shadow Priest that continues pretty much. It was all the way towards the bottom 5 or 6 specs, and then after January the 9th, massive continuous spikes of buffs all the way to where it is now. Similar growth goes to Arms Warrior, which was also similarly quite bogged in the middle after the buffs. Arms Warrior started rising as well. Who didn't have nearly as much of a successful finish was Devastation Evoker, which was similarly buffed like Shadow Priest, so they almost got at the same level after 2 or 3 weeks of getting buffed, but then they did not follow up. They did not stay at the same level of Shadow Priest in the basically upcoming, in the following month of February. What we do also see very easily is the switcheroo between rogues, because the situation at the start, roughly a month into the tier, was that Outlaw was clearly the best, literally gapping everyone. The second best at times was its counterpart in the rogue class, Subtlety, and then Outlaw was nerfed. Outlaw was nerfed in its generation of combo points, and all of a sudden it started slowly but surely dropping down below Subtlety and going down to mix itself with the second tier of specs, while Subtlety went to join the top tier of specs, currently made up of Shadow Priest and Arms Warrior. The last one we can see as we quickly, slowly but surely start getting rid of some of the specs. The last one we can see is the growth, eventually but surely, of Hunters. We can start seeing it a little bit more here. The 3 Hunter specs have been suddenly growing, definitely more than what they were before, thanks to the couple of buffs back to back that they received recently. The 5% all damage buff to all 3 specs, and then in 10.0.7 more buffs will go the way of Hunters. So these have been more or less the updates to look for in our raid review. The overtaking of Outlaw by Subtlety after Outlaw was nerfed, the continuing growth of Arms Warrior, which is now a solid, stable top 3 specs, together with the buffs received at the same time by Devastation and Shadow Priest, which brought Shadow Priest very high towards the top, but did not bring Devastation nearly as high. It definitely made Devastation better and stronger, but not an S tier spec like Shadow Priest became. And lastly, the improvement of the 3 Hunter specs, which is still bound to continue once the next patch comes out. So this was our Sunday review, our Sunday recap of the situation in Vault of the Incarnates so far. At this point, actually, almost 3 months since Vault of the Incarnates opened. With this done with, I am going to leave you to the rest of your Sunday, as I myself also have things to do on this weekend. So thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. Support can come in many free ways, liking and commenting down below, subscribing to the channel itself. You can also follow me over on Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch, right at these links. Those ways to support would still be appreciated, despite being completely free of charge. Still, I hope. With this being said, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, every time I'm like, oh yeah, next week, the raid recap, next week, sure. And then it's like 15 days later. Oh shit, the raid recap.